everyone. Okay, this is a presentation just to go over 4 of the operative reports, which are noted as case studies in your textbook. As noted in the informational documents, back for the objectives and assignments of this lesson, number 2 is discussed in the lecture document, lecture PowerPoint, and the lecture video. This presentation will go over 1, 3, 5, and 7, the operative cases or the operative reports noted as 1, 3, 5, and 7. 2 is provided in the lecture document, lecture video. 4, 6, and 8, you are asked to code and post to the discussion board, non-graded discussion board in this class. And those answers will open for you before this lesson or before the midterm opens. You will get the answers to 4, 6, and 8 and have the opportunity to ask questions. So this presentation is only looking at specific ones, the 4 noted above, 1, 3, 5, and 7. So the first one is a femoral artery bypass. And in this presentation, if you can see it, if you're not colorblind or have any colorblind issues, you can see that the detail or something about, like, so to identify which case I'm talking about is highlighted here in yellow. So this first one is a femoral artery bypass. The root operation is bypass. The origin of the bypass is the left femoral artery, and the body part that is being bypassed is the right femoral artery. An open approach is per the surgical approach per the documentation. Some of the key words from the clinical information is incisions were made in both groins simultaneously, and each common femoral and superficial femoral artery was approached. On the left side, the common femoral artery and superficial femoral artery were palpated. Point was chosen for the anastomotic site. A tunnel was then created from the right to the left through the tissue and over to the right. The right common femoral artery was then examined. Arteriotomy was then made, and the graft was brought through the groin, was then sized, and the anastomosis was begun. So our indexing, when we're moved to the ICD-10 PCS coding book or coding manual, we're going to index the main term of bypass. Their subterms are anatomy, which is femoral left. We're given 041L in the alpha. As per our process, we then move to the 041 table. We verify the L, and we then make our choices for the rest of our code. The next choice is our surgical approach. The word incision was used several times. Incision, if you go back to chapter 1, equates to open. We choose 0 for open. Device. Was a device or substance used to do this bypass? Yes. It says it was a prosthetic graft per our given documentation in our textbook. We choose J from this row for this table. Then when we're dealing with these bypasses, we do often have to have some type of positive value for our qualifier. In this case, the qualifier is identifying where did this bypass go to. The right femoral artery, we choose H. So the femoral, a code for the femoral left to the femoral right bypass is 041L0JH. But we're not done. You also need to code what is documented as a thrombolectomy. It states in the clinical documentation, as distal control was released on the right superficial femoral artery, back bleeding was noted to be poor, therefore a thrombolectomy was performed. Per our information in our textbook, what we've learned in a previous chapter, a thrombus is considered solid matter. So the removal of a thrombus equates to the root operation of extirpation. We're going to index the main term, extirpation, which is also the root operation. Then the anatomy, which is artery femoral right. We're given 04CK in the alpha index of our ICD-10 coding manual. We move to the 04C table. We confirm our body part value. Then we choose our surgical approach. Our surgical approach is still open because of all those incisions. 0 is our option for open surgical approach. Was a device left in? No. They are removing this blood clot. They're not leaving anything in the patient's body at this location. The only option also is Z at that particular row and table. Then we have our qualifier value. For our qualifier value at this particular row and table, we have two options. We have 6 and Z. 6 is defined as bifurcation. There's no identification of that word in our clinical information. And the use of bi means dual. So like a bicycle, bi means two. So bifurcation is relating to two parts, two branches, two valves, two something. No documentation of that in this particular clinical documentation, so we choose Z for our final body part character value, for our final qualifier character value, and then the final code for the work of removing the blood clot, which is noted in your clinical documentation as a thrombolectomy of the right femoral artery, is 04CK0ZZ. So for this particular operative report, noted to be number 1 in your textbook at the end of chapter 11, you have two codes, 041L0JH, that's for the bypass, and 04CK0ZZ for the thrombolectomy. Moving on to number 3, which is identified at the end of chapter 11 as a CABG times 3. It says coronary artery bypass graft times 3 off pump, specifically in your textbook. This procedure involves the treatment of 2 coronary arteries with a left internal mammary artery bypass graft and 1 coronary artery with a greater saphenous vein graft. The procedures are documented as being performed using an open approach. And when we look at the lima is the left internal mammary artery, that has no device value because it's not being disconnected from the blood source. So if we go and we're going to code the first part of the procedure, which was the 2 arteries that were being bypassed with the lima, from the lima. So we're going to index the main term of bypass, then artery, then coronary, and then 2, because we have the lima to the circumflex and the lima to the left anterior descending. You're given 0211 in the alpha index of your ICD-10 PCS coding manual. You move to the 0211 table. You verify your selection of 1, which equates to 2 arteries. The next character value you have to choose is your surgical approach. States in your clinical documentation, I opened the chest. That is an open surgical approach. Value for that is 0. Device character value is your next choice. Was a device left in the patient at the end of the surgery, or was some device already there that the physician or surgeon is working on? The answer is no, so we choose Z. The last character value at the table is where did this bypass begin? Not end up, begin. It started at the lima, the left internal mammary artery. We choose 9 at that row at that table. The final code for the lima bypass grafts, and there were 2 of them, 02110Z9. But that's only a CABG times 2. This patient had a CABG times 3. 3 meaning how many vessels, arteries were bypassed. So we have another artery to code. In this case, the last artery was bypassed using the patient's own greater saphenous vein. You could certainly code the vein harvesting first, but in this case, we're going to code the artery bypass first. You're going to index bypass, coronary, 1 artery. You're given 0210 in the alpha. You move to the 021 table. You verify that the 0, the last 0 here, equates to 1 artery. Surgical approach is still open. Device. Was there a device used? They considered the vein to be a device because it was moved from the leg up to the patient's heart. Therefore, you're going to choose 9 for autologous venous tissue. This is the patient's own. Auto means self. The patient is donating to themselves. They're taking the vein from the patient's leg and moving it to the heart. The last character value here for this code is qualifier. Where did this bypass start? It started in the aorta. That's where it started. You choose W. Clinical documentation. Your textbook states the aorta was side clamped and the aortotomy and the anastomosis were quickly performed. So it began at the aorta. The final code for the bypass from the aorta using the patient's own saphenous vein, 021009W. But again, as I stated earlier, you also need to code the harvesting because it's a different body part, different anatomical location. Per coding guidelines, you also need to code the getting of the vein from the patient's leg. The specific location was the patient's left greater saphenous vein. They didn't take all of it, they took part of it. For this graft, root operation is excision. You're going to index excision vein greater saphenous left. You're given 06BQ in the alpha. You move to the 06B table. Again, you verify your body part value of Q. Then the next choice we need to make at the table is the surgical approach. How was this done? How was this vein grafting done? Or vein harvesting done? It states in your clinical documentation it was endoscopic. So we choose 4. Then our next choice is for device. The only device option at that row, at that table, is Z. That makes it easy. The next and the last character value choice is for qualifier. For qualifier at that particular row, at that particular table, there's 2 options, which is X and Z. And X means diagnostic. There's no documentation this was diagnostic, and it wasn't diagnostic. So we choose Z. So our final code for the harvesting of the patient's own greater left saphenous vein, 06BQ4ZZ. So for this particular procedure, you have 3 codes. The next operative report is noted as number 5. The patient's having a direct stent placed in the proximal mid-left anterior descending coronary artery, and the stent is a drug-eluting stent. This is part of a PTCA procedure, which is reviewed in your textbook chapter information. PTCA stands for percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty. Excuse me. Also, per your clinical documentation, this patient's particular piece of anatomy that they're working on was 80% impacted. So it was 80% closed off. They're putting this in to open up this space. That relates to the root operation of dilation. We're going to index dilation and coronary, 1 artery. We're only coding 1 artery per the clinical information we have in front of us. You are given 0270 in the alpha index. You move to the 027 table. You verify your body part value. Then you have to determine your surgical approach. Per your clinical information, it states a catheter was used in the patient's femoral artery. They're going to put the catheter in via a small incision. That equates to, if you go back to chapter 1, that equates to a percutaneous surgical approach. So at that table on the first row, we're going to choose 3. Then for our device character value, we have to make a decision. Was a device left in the patient at the end of the procedure? The answer to that question is yes. They left in this stent to keep this artery wall open. What kind of device? It was documented as a drug-eluting stent. At that table, at that row, we're going to choose then 4. 4 equates to an intraluminal, which means inside a lumen, and inside of a lumen, and a lumen means vessel. So inside a vessel device, drug-eluting. In the qualifier for character value, we have 2 choices, 6 and Z. There's no documentation of bifurcation, so we choose Z. The final code for the drug stenting of the proximal mid descending coronary artery with a CYPHER, C-Y-P-H-E-R, CYPHER drug-eluting stent, and that's the manufacturer name of the stent, The code is 027034Z. And the last one, number 7, is very similar to the one we just did. Number 7 is a primary PTCA and stent placement. Per the note in the textbook, we're only coding the stent. However, it is more than one. The patient had 2 stents, and this particular manufacturer's type they used was called a vision stent. In your clinical information, it states vision stent was deployed to the mid-right coronary artery. A second vision stent was deployed proximal to the first. So the root operation is similar, it's dilation, but we do have 2 stents. So index dilation, artery, coronary, 1 artery. So only 1 artery. We're given 0270 in the alpha index, move to the 027 table. Approach again was via a catheter. Small incision equates to percutaneous, but in this case, it was 2 stents, not 1. They were intraluminal, and there's no documentation that they were drug-eluting. So we choose E at that particular row in table. Then our last character values for qualifier, no documentation of bifurcation, so we choose Z. Then we have 02703EZ for the placement of 2 vision stents for this particular patient. If you have any questions on this presentation, please post to the discussion board for lesson 9, or of course you can inbox me. Keep working at it. You will begin to get the basics down of ICD-10 PCS. I promise you, if you keep practicing, it will become easier as you start moving through some of these more complicated clinical pieces of documentation.